Hello, everyone. Do you like listening to music through a good stereo? So do I. Do you like listening to movies or watching movies through a good stereo? So do I. The question is, have you ever found yourself skipping to an action part of a movie just so you can sit back with your eyes closed and listen to your surround sound to see how well it sounds? Or have you ever turned on a particular song and listened to it over and over because of the production value and changed the settings on your stereo between Dolby, DTS, THX, and all these different music and video settings to see what sounds best? If you've done that, you probably know where I'm coming from when I say it is a cluster. I won't even say the word. It's a horrible world out there when you're trying to find the perfect sound. And it's also a wonderful world. In today's atmosphere, we have so many different settings for music and movies, and the different Dolby settings that have come out are just mind-boggling. So I wanted to go over some of the basics because I'm the kind of guy who loves music. I have a lot of different settings. I understand that, in the 70s there was quadraphonic sound was, supposed to be the future. It was the early surround sound. And you can still find some quadraphonic receivers. I believe I still have one. And it's an old Marantz stereo, but I've always been kind of a music nerd and a sound nerd, I guess, not just music. And I went through a phase, like a lot of folks did, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, where surround sound was relatively new. And it became an obsession of finding the right speaker placement, the right distance. And after a time, I came to the conclusion that I really preferred a two-channel home stereo setup. And I've been through dozens of different speakers. So, as well as receivers and everything else. Right now I'm using a Pioneer receiver, relatively new. It doesn't have any inputs for HDMI in it. I'm kind of old school and I don't have a lot of money. And so maybe this is more for the person who doesn't have a lot of money, who wants to get the best sound, and give you my opinion on what these settings really mean and what might be the best sound for your needs. And this is very vague. If anybody who knows anything about stereos might be already scoffing, like, there is no general consensus. Everyone's room is different. Your ear shape is different. If you're ever watching or listening to music and you turn your ears outwards and see the difference in how you perceive sound. Wall treatments. What kind of pictures do you have on your walls? Do you have any cloth hanging? Do you have wallpaper or flat walls or textured ceilings? All these things play a role. But the listening experience of the individual is what's most important. And so I'm going to go through briefly all these different settings. Okay, so we have Dolby Digital, the standard Dolby Digital, and this is the decoding for movies and Netflix and various other streaming sites are using this more and more, so now it's become standard. Now, for the longest time I was just using two-channel and using the standard matrix type settings on my stereo, but I recently got a new TV, finally, which only had an optical output. So I hooked up the optical output to my stereo. If you have this type of a hookup, then your stereo will instantly go to whatever setting is required by the show you're watching, depending on the stereo you have. But I'm assuming that you have, something that can decode Dolby Digital. Otherwise, there's no point in watching this because this doesn't cover old receivers. Dolby Digital is a standard 5.1 surround, and all the 0.1 means is a subwoofer, so it's 5 channels, right? You have, two channels, then 2 surrounds, and then a subwoofer. There's Dolby Digital EX, which is the second one, that creates a 6.1 surround out of the 5.1 channels. So if you have extra speakers, it will create a phantom channel, if you will. I've found that Digital EX, in my opinion, on my stereo, is my favorite setting for movies. If I'm watching Netflix or anything else, Digital EX adds enough from the back speakers to where you get a more full, rich soundstage. In my room, the way I have it set up, so you should know what I have is a 7.1, basically. I have 2 front speakers, then I have 2 front surround speakers on top of those, and then 2 rear surrounds to the side. And so there's Dolby EX, which creates 6.1. Then there's Digital Plus, which creates a 7.1. And 7.1 means you have a rear channel as well. Never found the need for a rear channel. And in fact, with the right settings, you don't even need side channels. And I get to that in a little bit. But for the longest time, I didn't even use surround speakers on the rear because I didn't need it with the way the room bounced sound. It was phenomenal. Okay, so those are the first three. Then there's Dolby True HD, and this one's used for Blu-rays mostly, and it's considered a lossless format because the other forms you compress a lot of the audio, so you lose some of the quality. For the average person, this doesn't mean a damn thing. Unless you have a $50,000 stereo, you're probably not going to notice the difference. And some people prefer, the compression, the way that it naturally processes the sound works for some people. It just depends on who you are and how well you hear. Then there's Pro Logic 2, which is another one. That creates a surround sound from just stereo sound. So you use Pro Logic 2 when you have, say you're listening to your favorite record and it only has 2 channels, or you're coming from a 2-channel source and you think, well, I just want to create kind of a virtual surround sound. And it actually does a pretty good job. I've always been very surprised by that. Then there's different settings for that, which are usually movie, music, and games. And you have to decide whether you're watching movies or music, and it really does make a difference because there are some other settings like sci-fi or different movie types. I've never used those. They're like called matrix settings. It decodes it as to what it thinks a sci-fi movie should sound like. And you might find one of these, that works for you, but I haven't yet. Then there's Pro Logic 2X. Now we're getting to number 6. That converts 5.1 surround into 6.1 or 7.1. None of these ones really matter. I'm just listing them off. Then there's Pro Logic 2Z. And then there's Atmos. And Dolby Atmos is supposedly the latest and greatest in surround sound. And it adds new elements. It adds this, the center speaker on the ceiling and the subwoofer in the center. Some people have subwoofers under their couch. There's all types of different settings. I'm not getting into this. I'm trying to stick to the basics. What works for the person who maybe has a few hundred to spend, maybe has some aftermarket stuff. For me, a subwoofer is essential for it. It's a very important factor. Atmos is called the 5.1.2 system because it adds height, that other dimension. So those are all the Dolbys, and that I know of. And what do I stick to? The Dolby 2. Or it will add a certain, I don't know. For me, Dolby 2 works. I don't know why. It works on my system. It works for what I have in my system. But to be honest, as I was going to say, I use DTS most of the time when I'm watching movies or listening to music, which is the next type of format. There's DTS. The reason why people use DTS is because it's a higher rate and it's lossless, or more lossless, less compression, therefore you get a better sound. That's what I've read. But as I said before, unless you have a really high-end system, you probably won't notice much of a difference, just like speaker cables or anything else. There are only a few there's DTS ES, there's DTS HD, there's DTS X, there's DTS Neural X, and DTS Virtual X. But the only one that I use is the DTS Neo 6 setting. And that is basically, you either have cinema or music setting on it, and you can choose Neo 6 and it will convert and create like a 6.1 channel for you. Any source that I'm using that doesn't have its own Dolby or surround sound dedicated, or if it's not coming straight from the TV, that's the setting I use. And regular surround sound tends to neglect the rear speakers a lot, unless there's a huge action scene going on, right? So you don't get very much sound. You don't even know if they're on sometimes. But if I use the Neo 6 setting or the Dolby 2 setting, it puts more information through those rear speakers. And therefore, when I'm sitting on my couch, I feel like I'm more surrounded by the events going on. And a lot of people don't care for this. They don't want to be immersed in it. They want, the voice to come just through the center speaker and the rest of it to come through here, but only if there's a jet or something flying by do they want to hear it on the sides. And I'm different. I like to hear it throughout the the movie. You know, action scenes, I like to feel like I'm completely immersed in them. And on the note of center speaker, I don't use a single center speaker like a lot of people do, or like a sound bar. What I do is I route in parallel. I have two separate speakers. There's six by ones. There's a 6-inch speaker and a tweeter. These little old Bic Venturi speakers from like the early 90s. They're about this tall. And I have one on each side of the TV, and I have them wired in parallel, which means that the wires go into one and then straight out into the other one. Now I've tried to wire them in series where it goes through one and then through the other, but it drops the sound level down on each speaker. Running them in parallel, it does change the ohms, and I don't want to get into all that. I'm not a huge nerd when it comes to all this stuff because, I mean, I am obviously, but I'm not, I don't know all the facts on, you know, the ohms. I've never really had any issues with the stereo. Like even when I wire speakers in parallel or series or change the ohms, it's all about adjusting it to what sounds good to you. But I feel like having a center speaker, which consists of two separate side speakers, gives a better sound stage because of the width of my speakers in the room that I have. There's also a couple other settings like THX and IMAX, and I don't use those or know much about them. And I mean, there's no point in going into detail, really. I'm just sticking to what I find works. But as I said before, I prefer a 2-channel speaker system if I can, with music a lot of the time. I mean, I love that Neo 6 sound when I'm sitting on the couch, but there's one more setting that I do use on a stereo, which only some have. It's a 7-channel. It's just called 7-channel. It means that every speaker gets equal sound, and I use that for parties, you know, or when I have a bunch of people over. So every speaker's equally cranking it out, and you get a louder sound through every speaker. But my surround speakers consist of small speakers. My front surrounds are a little bigger. They're 3-ways. But my floor speakers, or my mains, they consist of 2 12s, 2 mids, and 2 tweeters. They're 4.5 feet tall. They weigh 110 pounds each. They're called RTR, and they were from the 70s. They were about $3,000 for the pair back in the 70s. I picked them up like used for $50 off Craigslist one day. Huge speakers. And those put out a soundstage that is very unique, so it's not going to compare to the average home stereo. Most people won't put speakers that large in their house. So that's about all I got. Hoping I covered everything, and I know that was kind of general, and I'd really like to make this into a longer detailed video where I point out all the details in the video and, you know, put the words out there and links for you all to, you know, but that's just not my style right now. But if you do have questions about this, if this is your nerddom as well, feel free to ask me in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer. So, be well. Talk to y'all later. And get that sound you like and what works for you. And don't listen to the you know, critical sound nerds that think they know everything. Because it's very unique to each room. The sound treatment, the individual, the type of stereo, what you like. Peace.